Welcome to this very exciting masterclass on how to build your first party data strategy from scratch. We are very soon to be entering into a cookie-less world. We all know of why we will have to build a first-party data strategy. But in this masterclass, what we will help you is step-by-step process on how you can build your first-party data strategy, some tech and innovation considerations that you should keep in forefront of your mind while building this first-party data strategy. And we will share with you some easy to use frameworks, examples, industry case studies on some brands which have successfully built a first party data strategy for you to take examples from. Moving on, to introduce you to our speaker for the event, Vishal Sukheja. He's a Chief Product Officer from FirstHive. He has been with FirstHive since its very inception, and he comes with over 16 years of experience across product development, product management, product marketing. So I do not think there can be a better person that we could bring to you to take you through this entire masterclass. A very warm welcome to Vishal.
Thanks, Ashwin.
Before I hand over the screen to him, quickly I'll walk you through some of the house rules. As you can see, all the lines have been placed on mute to avoid any interruptions during the presentations. However, we will take up Q&A in the last 5 to 10 minutes. Having said that, please use the chat feature of Meets to put in all the thoughts, questions, ideas that you may have throughout the session. This session is being recorded. In case you want to avail the recording, we will be sharing the same with you within 48 hours of the closure of this masterclass.
Thank you, and a warm welcome to all our audience members today. As part of the next 30 odd minutes, what I'm going to try and cover is the high level basis in terms of how do you start off your journey of building your first party data strategy. Couple of assumptions that we've obviously made is that you understand the importance of first party data, while we will aim to cover that. And more importantly, you understand what first party data represents. Uh, the Over the next 25-30 odd minutes, the aim or what you should expect from this webinar is an actionable framework that we will aim to provide in terms of how do you get started on your first party data collection and activation strategy. And we will also try and validate what we are saying with a proof of concept or a success story from the real world of a brand that would hopefully be relatable. And at the end of the webinar, we will also be sending across a small workbook, which is also available on our website, that will help you create essentially an ebook of sorts that will help you actually create and document your entire strategy and kind of gives you certain enormous in of how do you potentially get started. But before we jump into the meat, right, I want to start off with a very simple and a story that I'm sure all of us would have heard while we were small, which is of Hansel and Gretel. Now, the way the original story obviously goes is that Hansel and Gretel, two kids lost in the forest, while they had taken certain precautions to be able to find their way back in the form of dropping some breadcrumbs or dropping some food articles, they had certain birds who came in ended up eating those breadcrumbs, as a result of which they were not able to find their way back home, and we all know what happened post that. Uh, the way we like to draw this analogy is you look at the home that they're trying to get back to as your brand, which is where you want your customers to come back to. Hansel and Gretel here being your customers. And the obvious expectation here is that if the customers are able to find their way back to your brand, back to this house, you will be able to provide a great experience for them. Now, to help you provide that great experience and to be welcome back, the customers are dropping these breadcrumbs, they are dropping these cookies, they are dropping some information in the form of zero party data that they want you to be able to capture, they want you to be able to store and process and derive insights from. So that the next communication that you have with them in your house, the next time you are able to speak with them, that conversation is a lot more relevant, it's a lot more topical, it's a lot more contextual. And that is what the most of the consumers are also trying to achieve here. But the problem obviously comes in with the ITP regulation that Safari and Apple have kind of rolled out, or the Chrome announcing the third-party cookie deprecation. All of that will basically mean that those become the birds that are coming in to to stop this collation of information that you potentially could have used to provide a better experience for the brand. And that, in a nutshell, is I think what we kind of used to talk about the importance of why you cannot rely on only these breadcrumbs that are being dropped here, which are reliant on other providers, but you need to have your own data asset built. And that is the entire first party data framework that we are referencing as part of this webinar. So all of that is great, and obviously the world's kind of moving towards everyone's talking about moving away from your third party based targeting. How do you operate in a cookieless world? And with the new regulation coming in, your the importance of first party data as a strategic differentiator, I think, is fairly well understood. But the common question that we get asked by a bunch of our prospects and customers also is, all of that sounds great, but how do I even start? So what we've tried to do here is provide a certain series of actionable steps that you can break down this entire journey into, that will help you better understand your customer data, better analyze your customer behavior, build a comprehensive, a relevant value exchange to be able to get this data, create the enabler ecosystem to be able to draw on that data itself, and depending on what objectives are you building the data for, or building the data asset for, how do you activate that? And these are the four key things in terms of the actionable steps that we will be covering in detail as we move ahead here. So to start off, how do you evaluate and optimize your existing customer journeys? Now, here, let's take a simple example. As a consumer, whichever be your favorite brand that you look at, one way for you to essentially kind of play this is take off your marketer's hat, get into the shoes of your consumer, and understand what are the different contexts, what are the different scenarios, what are the different use cases, and the different touch points at which you have your consumers, your end customers, your shoppers, depending on who are you targeting and through what channel are you reaching out to them for. How do they come in and interact with your brand? That becomes the first key customer journey map that you need to list down. In the next slide, we will be showing you one representative journey map in terms of how do you go about this process itself. But again, plenty of these examples are available online. Just feel free to Google that, or in the workbook that we will be sharing at the end of this webinar, we would be including one such journey map there as well. But bottom line here is you need to understand the entire consumer journey, right from awareness to your actual action. Any touch point where the consumer potentially comes in and interacts in any form or manner. And through that, what as part of the entire journey, you will also be able to identify the different interfaces, the different touch points that you have, which are your marketing systems of interaction or systems of transaction that you may have built out there. Now, once you have that journey map built out, and once you have listed down these touch points, which is where these interactions are potentially happening, and this could span your website, this could span e-stores, this could span retail, physical in-store walk-ins, this could span data potentially coming in from your point of sale systems. It could be your Facebook page, your Instagram handles, your Twitter handles, and so on. Across your customer care, any promoter applications that you may be utilizing, any offline promotions or mall activations that your brand may be engaging in, any intermediaries that through which your customers potentially engage with you, especially if you are belonging to the financial services space. All of that basically becomes the universe from where potentially you can get access to some customer data, some first party and zero party data can potentially be aligned. What you need to now do is identify all the different systems that you potentially have put in place. And you need to obviously build on your data collection strategy, which is across each of these touch points. Potentially, what is the data that you can and you want to collate? And obviously, goes without saying that you need to have a policy in place in terms of being able to, one, derive consent from the interaction with the consumer, and two, being able to explicitly call out what purpose will that data be used for. Both of these are important, and we'll be covering that a little ahead in terms of their dependencies. So this is one example of a customer journey map that we've kind of called out, which is across different states of mind of the customer, which is starting off with what does the customer think or feel, what are the different steps that he undergoes with reference to the interaction with you, what kind of actions does the customer potentially take, what is her the different touch points through which she comes in and interacts, what potentially do you think is working regarding that the interaction, and what potentially can change, and what will it take to effect that change. All of that goes in as part of the initial building block of you trying to analyze and evaluate your existing customer journey. Uh, Again, here a small snippet from our workbook, which is where you are able to kind of call out the different touch points through which you are able to collate this information. But the key thing here, right, is what are you trying to do as part of these interactions? One, you are obviously trying to collate that PII information, collate any preference based information, collate any relevant information that will either help you from a behavioral targeting perspective or will help you provide a more personalized experience for this consumer. Along with this, the second thing that you are also trying to do is again something that I think should be fairly rustex by now is seek consent. And while we've explicitly called out cookie consent here, you need to ensure that across each of these touch points, you are explicitly calling out in a transparent manner what is the data that you are seeking to collect from the customer, how long will that data potentially be stored for, and what is the explicit purpose for which the data will be utilized. And obviously again here the onus is on you as the custodian of that data, as the custodian of the brand's values, that the right policies would be implemented on top of this data asset to ensure that you don't circumvent any of these explicit asks that you have aligned with the customer. One of the things that we like to kind of speak internally as well, right? Is that for brands, it's simple to seek loyalty from a customer, but for the brands themselves, they first need to exhibit that loyalty. They need to exhibit the values that they are claiming that they potentially stand by. And that brings me to the second point here, which is again, right, from a consumer's perspective, what's in it for them? Why would a consumer, why would a customer, why would a shopper at that point of interaction be okay with sharing that data, sharing that consent with you as a brand? And this is where there has to be a potential value exchange that has to be built in into any such interaction from where you are trying to access or collate any such customer data. This forms the basis of your permission based marketing. This is obviously going to be completely consent backed. And as a brand, you need to be absolutely transparent, again, at the sake of repetition, that the consent you are taking is on a specific data asset that you are trying to collate, the purpose for which the collation is happening, and what is the time period for which the data potentially will be stored. Now, what that value exchange could be, there are some brands that go with some fairly simple value exchanges in the form of give me your data, in the sense of give me a missed call on buying this product and I will give you a 10 rupee Paytm voucher, or give me a send me an SMS with a specific keyword that tells me that you bought this product, and on the basis of that I'll enter you in a lucky draw and you win a gold coin and similar. I mean, all of those kind of marketing campaigns we would have all come across. And each of this is a form of value exchange where the reward is being essentially laid out against the data that as a consumer you are willing to share with the brand. But there are some fairly interesting examples of how other companies have done that in a much more seamless, regulated manner, starting off obviously with gated assets. So on our own website, for example, uh, we seek your first party data in order to be able to offer a more personalized experience to you as a potential customer, as a potential client, or an existing customer. And for that, we are offering the gated content as a value exchange, as a reward for sharing that information on who you are. uh, Potentially you could do karma points. So there are entire sites like Reddit and Imager and others that work on the concept of make believe karma points, a little like Bitcoin, I guess. But the key thing there is that while the points itself may not be worth anything except the internal on platform cloud for the individual, it does offer a way for users to share certain information with the brand. one-on-one consultation with brands at free or subsidized rates, discount coupons on sharing your information. All of those are examples where brands have utilized as some form of value exchange to be able to get this customer data being ingested. And obviously, what kind of value exchange you will also lay out will greatly vary between whether you are a B2C brand or a B2B brand, and who your primary customer is that you're trying to take get access to this data for. A lot of the examples that you see as part of our worksheet here are what would be more relevant in a B2B scenario, obviously. While in B2C scenarios, you have sampling programs, you have tie-ins to loyalty or reward programs that work. You have your discount and upsell offers saying, give me this information instead of a 1 kg SKU, I will ship a 1.5 kg SKU to you and similar. So all of those basically become points of that. And again, here there are certain brands that have gamified this also fairly well. What I mean by that is for sharing additional data. For example, let's say in actual games that you may have played or in certain applications, I'm sure as you would have seen, you have profile completion meters being seen. So I think LinkedIn is one such app that does this really well, which is as you add more details about yourself, till they deem your profile to be 100%, they will keep nudging you intermittently saying, hey, why don't you add this data? Why don't you add this data? You will get a lot more views, which is the value exchange in that context. And the minute you get to 100%, automatically you become an all-star profile and so on. The other key thing here is as a brand, you need to invoke that trust to be for the user to be able to share that information with you. And this is where you can have your social proof points, you can build in some incentives, because again, there will be different types of consumers, different types of stakeholders who are interacting with your asset or your interaction touchpoint, in which case you do not necessarily know at the outset what will potentially work for whom. This is a representative data collection roadmap that we kind of speak about, which is where, as part of the example that we kind of called out, you would have different sources, both online and offline, for your brand, where you have your customers, your consumers, your shoppers, your different stakeholders coming in and interacting with you. Now, as we called out earlier, this could be walk-in point of sale system, this could be e-stores, this could be your CRM where you have customer related information that's residing. It could be your mobile apps, your own websites or landing pages on ads that you are running. It could be a customer help desk that you are running. You could be taking customer surveys. It could be your invoices. Bottom line, across an entirety series of potential first party data sources and zero party data sources, where you have customers who are either coming in and explicitly calling out their preferences, or you have the potential to extract their behavioral information from. The idea here is to look at that universe and identify potentially sources where you have customers coming in and interacting with you, but that is data that you may or may not be capturing today. One example that we see fairly often is social. So when we talk about social, typically your Facebook, Google, Twitter act as walled gardens, where you need to pay for access to the own data that you may have curated as a community. But again, here, what you are able to essentially do is with respect to the developer toolkit APIs, you have certain data which are deemed as consent backed, which are your first party interaction link data. Examples could be likes on your post, it could be comments on your post, it could be replies or retweets of your post on Twitter and similar. And that again becomes data that legitimately you are able to ingest and at least target within the same platform. But identification of existing and new data sources from where potentially you can unlock this data asset become fairly important. Here now again across each of these you need to build out the relevant value exchange, which would be in the form of personalized real-time offers. It could be a gated or member-only content or similar, and all of that is what is intended to yield a true customer single view for you, which is what you ideally should be able to use for any forward activity, for any key objectives that you are trying to drive. Because at the end of the day, and this is something that we need to be cognizant of, that whatever work you will be doing to build your first party data asset, as a marketer, you are all as a data practitioner, you will always be still held accountable to your monthly, your quarterly, your annual targets, your annual goal achievements. And from that perspective, how does this data asset that's being collated tie in with this larger objective that you need to drive for the brand in that given period obviously becomes super important. And this is where platforms like FirstHive, obviously this is a shameless plug at this point, uh, will uh, will help you drive that. Now, using that as a segue, what basically comes in is you have identified here the key interfaces or the key data, the key touch points from where you want to start ingesting this customer data, and you've also identified well what is the data that you want to capture. You have created your communication strategy so that the entire process is transparent, and you've also gone ahead and built the value exchange so that consumers are more keen or they are absolutely open to start sharing this data with you. Sorry. But at this point now, you need to ensure that you also have the right technology partner to back you for being able to collate this data, being able to manage and process this data and derive either the customer single view or being able to derive any forward activation use cases that you want to potentially drive from this activity. The key thing here, and I believe this was also part of one of the questions that had come in before the webinar, is that there are regulations that you need to be cognizant of. Because any data that you are essentially collating here, you are not the data owner as the brand. The owner remains the data subject or the consumer or the shopper, whoever is the individual who's sharing the data with you. And you are only acting as the data custodian or the data processor. Hmm. While the ownership is obviously not something that's kind of moved to you. How do you then, in that within that guardrails or within that boundary, have an ecosystem built where you are able to seamlessly capture this data? And again, this is another thing that we like to speak about internally, which is that data, it's a little like white noise. So unless you have the right antenna at the point of the interaction to be able to capture this data, it's lost forever. You cannot go back to a customer and say, hey, can you please repeat that conversation that we had the other day on this particular channel? Or you cannot even for activation, let's say in a consumer category brand, go in 6 months post purchase and say, oh, by the way, you remember this purchase you had done? Let me talk to you on that. Doesn't work. So the onus is again on you to be able to provide the optimal customer experience. And this is obviously where platforms like FirstHive as a full stack customer data platform really shine. So what we've done here, you've collated the data, you now have a system, a tool. And again, one key thing here is that depending on the stage of your data program or of the stage of your company, depending on the number of consumers or number of shoppers of whose data you are trying to collate, this could very well be an Excel based exercise, it could be a simple CRM based exercise, or it could be something for which you've set up an internal data asset on a simple S3, on a simple data warehouse or a data lake based system. Or you could be looking at advanced use cases that you want to deploy via a CDP. All of that depends on a multitude of factors that stem from what do you need to use that data for? What are the key objectives that you are trying to drive? And how do you potentially start off in this entire journey of activating this data? The first building block of that obviously is consent, because everything that you need to do from this point on, having collated that data, is not to appear spammy, not to appear to be in breach of the trust that the customer has placed in you by sharing that information with you. And here you need to have a very transparent privacy policy available on all of your key data assets. You need to have explicit opt-outs created on each of these touch points that you are now going to utilize to reach out to these customers on. And this is where you either can use inbuilt capabilities of an existing tool like a consent management platform or others, or you can very well use your marketing automation tools or CDPs like FirstHive with their respective campaign manager platforms to better manage your customer consents and trigger communication on the basis of that. The second thing here, after having collated that data again, is making sense of that data. Because again, one of the key reason that we kind of start getting into a little advanced use cases when it comes to deployment with a CDP is that a lot of your customer data will not be directly stitchable. What I mean by that is the data that you will potentially collate from Facebook will not have the same primaries or the same attributes that you can use to tie that in with your CRM data, which may or may not have the relevant information to tie that in with your email system, which definitely will not have the relevant PII to map it with the cookies which you will place on your website and so on. Bottom line, what you are left with as a end result of even when you start collating this first party data asset is a host of channels or a host of data silos where you now have individual data within each interface within each channel, which you can optimize for the communication within that channel. But at an enterprise level, you still need to be able to bring all of that together to build a customer golden record or a single customer view or a customer 360. Plenty of terms exist, and I think the term has been itself has been fairly well abused. Martech being what it is, but this is where you potentially need to look at platforms like FirstHive to better help you make sense of that data and utilize advanced ML models that help you not just on a glorified VLOOKUP based deterministic mapping perspective, but also help you derive probabilistic graphs on the underlying data that help you understand the individual behind the interaction. So it is about getting to a scenario where you are able to draw out that, hey, this ping on my website, this login on my mobile app, the call to my customer care, this transaction on this point of sale are not four independent interactions that have happened, but have been potentially done by the same data subject Vishal. And the thing here again here is the choice of storage of the tool or the tech that you are kind of evaluating here is also important because who is the user of that? What do you want to utilize that data for? Becomes super critical in the sense what kind of integrations will need to be in play here. Whether you have scenarios where you will want to run advanced visualizations on the underlying data, what kind of ML models will you potentially want to deploy on top of that? All of that is the considerations that you will need to be cognizant of while you are making a choice of what tech to potentially partner with you. And this is where we then kind of move to the fourth part of the puzzle or fourth piece of the activation framework that we had spoken about earlier, which is how do you now get value out of this data extract asset that's being collected at your end, which is not dependent on third-party cookies, which is not entirely dependent or necessarily dependent on third-party walled gardens to that have you essentially being forced to pay for access. And this is where again a quick snippet from our workbook, where what are you trying to do with the data goes in to help you score and arrive at a strategy of how should you potentially activate the data for the use cases that you're trying to drive, while at the same time ensuring that for the consumer who is going to be interacting with you on these interfaces, the journey itself is seamless and you are able to carry the conversation and the context from one channel to another. And again, here, this how are you able to also potentially use certain predictive models to showcase the communication or potentially nudge your customers at a time that they are more open to consuming that content. I think that and again becomes a very important imperative that a lot of brands traditionally struggle with. So with this, I'm going to quickly jump into the case study that we intend to use as a showcase of the real life proof point of what FirstHive has delivered here. Now, the story goes something like this is a fairly well-known kids diaper brand, and as any parent in this call would know that this is a category which is not prone to churn. What I mean by that is if I look at my own kid, the first diaper brand that I bought was the last diaper brand that I bought for my kid. Nowhere in that journey did I feel the need to switch or try something else. And this typically happens when you look at, let's say, baby formula, and that's again representative of what's happening in the US right now. With the shortage, you have diapers, you have any such infant care category. One brand is as good or as bad as the other. And as long as you're using that, you wouldn't necessarily, in the absence of a real negative experience with the brand have any incentive to switch. So the brand had also identified that, and from that perspective, they were fairly active with online and offline programs that they were running to essentially catch the mothers young. What that meant was they were trying to capture the young mothers itself before the kid was born, right through their entire the last trimester, educating them on multitude of parameters, not just related to the kids' hygiene, and hopefully be a partner to them post the childbirth as well, which is where they also had offline on the ground activation in the form of partnerships with certain hospitals where welcome kits, which included this brand of diaper, obviously, was handed out to young mothers. This was independent of a sampling program that they would run through their website. They had partnerships with multiple e-commerce sites using fairly advanced campaign automation tools for running their email and SMS campaigns to a host of data that they were purchasing from second, third-party sources. They were also running a loyalty program to kind of top this off and be able to capture that first-party data and get the consent. And they were running on-the-ground promotions, mall activations, digital ads, the works, everything you could imagine. Obviously, this was all of on the back of a fairly significant marketing spend on ATL. So your hoardings, your TV ads, all of those were there. The problem, however, is that data everywhere, not a back to activate, which is that they had all of this data that's there, but whether it was a mother who's part of the sampling program that's contributing to the net increase in sales, or whether this is somebody who, let's say, has potentially been activated at a point but may or may not have continued the journey later, all of that were absolute black boxes. And a significant amount of marketing spends were being diverted equally across each of these channels with the intent to track buyer intent, but with mixed results till essentially we had gone in. What we were able to achieve there through the deployment of FirstHive is one, we helped them understand all of these different data assets that they had. And all of that is what we first started by bringing together in a single secure interface, a single secure FirstHive account for them. Now, this is where one in itself, it drove certain significant operational efficiencies for them because now for the first time ever, they were able to see all of the data together, draw out their cross-channel segments and being able to start building some hypotheses to even try figuring out answers to some of the questions they had. But along with that, what we obviously did for them is build this customer single view, gave them visibility into the entire customer journey right from intent to purchases. And this is where we also, as part of our data governance layer, were tying this back in with respect to consent and with respect to your attribution models that were being enabled here. All of that is what fed in to one, give them for the first time ever visibility at a channel level to understand what channels are really working for them versus which only are appearing to work, and the marketing mix they were able to play around with much better. Second also was in the form of data sources. So data from which source is helping them create those conversion funnels more cleaner than the others became another important metric. While return on ad spend was another metric that we were able to optimize by a factor of over 30%. And this was just in a period of 6 months across two of their key geographies of Thailand and Singapore. That's largely what we wanted to cover today. And I hope this session was useful and you've learned something new of this, or at best, at least it acted as a refresher for the rest of you. But before I end, just want to make sure that my word is not the only last word that you kind of hear on this topic of first party data and its importance. But even individuals like John Scully and Marissa Mayer and fairly leading analysts have kind of called out what is the importance of first party data, which is in terms of how reliant you need to ideally be to make on data to make much better marketing decisions and to potentially drive your brand higher. That's the time I had for this talk. We are happy to schedule a conversation with any of our internal experts and others. For a detailed discussion on any of our brands, reach us at marketing@firsthive.com and we'll be happy to speak.
So we kind of ran a couple of campaigns during the promotion of the event, and that is when we received few questions from people who registered. The first one being they want to know, is first party data collected a short term or a long term implantation?
Okay. So again, you're right. This is calculation of first party data is always to be seen as a strategic initiative that a marketing team embarks on. And from that perspective, as in most things strategic, this cannot be something that you are looking at as a tactical win or a short term objective, but this needs to be tied into the long term goal. But at the same time, you need to ensure that you have the relevant milestones built in to collate enough information about that to ensure that you're on the right path.
Right. The second question that we have is um, the attendee asks, how can I navigate scale challenges that come with a first party focused strategy?
Right. So when we talk about scale challenges, right, or when we talk about first party data strategy itself, it frankly depends on a multitude of factors, including what is the quantum of first party data that you are looking to collate, what kind of a audience base do you even have, what kind of a distribution model do you follow, and what potentially is the cumulative information that is out there that you potentially can even look at collating. Now, taking that into account, as I kind of called out in my talk earlier as well, it could very well be a simple Excel based exercise that a small D2C brand can potentially start with. But as it scales, you then start moving into a little more sophisticated tools like CRMs, from where you then we normally see a lot of companies evolving into setting up their data warehouses and internal data lakes with some sort of customer golden records being formed, from which when the onus now becomes more less on the collation of the data, more on how do I better derive value from the data. That is where advanced tools like FirstHive or basically customer data platforms come into play. So the key thing here is the entire scale challenges. You need to ensure that you have the right tech partners selected, depending on what life cycle stage you as a brand are following.
All right. Um, so basically, as you said, it depends on at what scale the brand is and how much data is actually coming into, is when they try to scale the challenges. So using the right tech partners. The last question is, what compliances should I take care of for a first party data? I know you've covered this throughout your talk about keeping it authentic, keeping it transparent, getting the right kind of, consents throughout the journey. But just a quick wrap up on the same point.
No, absolutely. So when we talk about first party data, the typical data privacy regulations obviously come into play, and there's none more familiar to for marketeers as GDPR, uh, launched back in 2018, and that's basically become the framework for every new privacy regulation that's been launched since then. So everything from your CCPA to PDPA to the upcoming Indian IDPA, all of them follow the similar policies or similar controls that they would ideally want a marketer or a brand to have on top of their data. Starting off with who owns the data, how do you kind of manage that, how do you transfer responsibilities of the management, how do you encrypt, and again, there are platforms that help you specifically gain compliance with these, or you could obviously look at tools like FirstHive.
So I think on that note, we can conclude today's session. Vishal, thank you so much for taking the time out, joining us. It was a very informative and engaging session.